Hello, everyone. Welcome to Design Together, a podcast exploring how designers work together. I am your host, Abby Ryan Guido, a designer and educator working in Philadelphia, collaborating everywhere. Today is a really exciting day for the podcast. I'm so honored to have David Dylan Thomas here today, author of Design for Cognitive Bias and a much more seasoned podcast host than I am. He's had a show for a while, the Cognitive Bias podcast that I know you had brought back and did a few more episodes. So thank you so much for being here, David.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. So this summer I read your book and I loved it so much. I actually used it in the classroom in the fall with my MFA students.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm extra excited to talk to you. And the book has so many great examples and it really impacted the way I design and I teach myself. So thank you for that. So this is why I'm excited. And I really was looking forward to this season to think about collaboration design in many more ways. And one of them being, what biases should we all be aware of when we're collaborating on teams? So before we dive into that, David, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to write your book?
Sure. So I've been doing experience design for 10 years or so, and somewhere in the middle of that, I stumbled onto a talk by Iris Bonnet called Gender Equality by Design. And in it, she points out how a lot of implicit gender and racial bias comes down to pattern recognition, which seems like a very simple thing and very solvable. So I decided I needed to learn everything I possibly could about cognitive bias. And my first step, obviously, was to Google it. And I found this Rational Wiki webpage that had like over 100 cognitive biases on it. And I'm like, I'm not going to figure this out in a day. So I just made a hobby of it. I picked one bias a day. I would read up on it. And the next day, go on to the next one, which inevitably turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. So eventually one friend in particular, who used to work for TED, she was like, please, Dave, just get a podcast. And, when someone who works for TED says you should probably get a podcast, you tend to listen.
Awesome.
So I did the Cognitive Bias podcast for a few years. And so while that skill set was growing at my day job at Experience Design, I started to see these parallels. And I was actually asked to give a talk by the city of Philadelphia that connected some of those dots around accessibility. And so I ended up coming up with examples of, hey, here's this bias, but here's this way you can use design to fight it. And I started coming up with a repertoire of those. Eventually that turned into a longer talk. And then someone from A Book Apart saw that talk and was like, let's talk. And that eventually became the book. So yeah, it was just this meshing of two different obsessions that I have, really.
That's amazing. How long did it take you to write the book?
So the book, I'd say about a year.
Okay.
Because the first draft came very easily to me because I had spent the prior 3 years just thinking about that topic and doing talks. So really, writing that first draft was just me opening up my Keynote and being like, okay, slide 1, start typing. Slide 2, start typing,
Awesome. So I was hoping we could just jump into kind of talking about which cognitive biases we should think about when we're collaborating. I mean, there's some that come to mind for me, the obvious ones, confirmation bias, but knowing there's so many biases, just like you, as soon as I picked up your book, I Googled it as well. And I landed on a page with, hundreds. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's got to be a bias about not knowing all the biases. But which come to your mind when you just think about just general collaboration in the creative world?
Yeah, I mean, the first one, honestly, that comes to mind is called the bandwagon effect. And it's pretty much what it sounds like, right? It's like if a whole bunch of other people think something's a good idea, you tend to think it's a good idea too. And the classic example is an experiment this guy Ash did where he put, I think it was 8 people in a room. And he showed them this slide that had one line that's like the reference line. It's like, here's a line. I'm going to show you these 3 other lines. You tell me which of these 3 other lines look the most like that first line.
Okay.
You'd sort of, vote. And there's one line that's obviously the answer, right? Let's say that's example A. And any rational person would just look at that and say, well, obviously it's A. But the thing is, you're in the room and the other 7 people in the room are in on the gag. So they all say B.
Okay.
And they go first. So you hear 7 people say it's B, and then when it gets to you, you're like, B? Right? Because you're like, and they would ask people what were you thinking? And they were like, well, I thought maybe I didn't understand the question, or maybe the other people knew something I didn't know, right? It shakes your confidence.
Sure.
And so to me, the really interesting variant on that exercise is where you have one other person in the room who's on your side. Okay. So if six people say A, but one other person says B before you, you now have the confidence to say B, and people were much more likely, or to say A. So people were much more likely to give the right answer if there was even one other person in the room. And AOC likes to say that courage is contagious. Well, this is scientifically true. Courage is contagious if you have one other person. So when I think about that in terms of collaboration and design, I think about two things, right? One is if you're designing platforms that are meant to facilitate collaboration, you need to make sure that if there's any kind of voting involved or any kind of like decision making involved, that the dissenters have line of sight to each other. Like if there is any kind of dissent, it's easy to know if other people are dissenting or have a similar view to you. And there's certainly design mechanisms to make that easier. The other piece, if you think about like actual real world collaboration, you think about things like, you know, a retro where it's like, everyone has to talk about what worked and what didn't work and what might work better the next time. And sometimes people will start those off by just saying, okay, what worked? Everyone raise your hand and say what worked, right?
Right.
And the problem with that is if someone in the room raises their hand and says, well, I think X worked, but you don't think X worked, you're much less likely to disagree, especially if that person has more power than you, right? You may have heard the term HIPPO, like highest paid person,
yeah.
right? So if they're in the room and they say something was good and you don't think it was good, you're going to be coerced into keeping your mouth shut, right?
Absolutely.
On the other hand, another way to do a retro is to say, okay, everyone write down on a sticky what you think worked and what you think didn't work, right? And now it's sort of anonymous and you just put it up on the board. And that way, once it goes up on the board, you can kind of see, well, these people thought this worked and these people thought the same thing didn't work. And you can have a discussion about it, right? And you're revealing this thing that otherwise, if you just have people vote in the open, is less likely to get discussed. So that when it comes to collaboration, sort of making it easy for courage to be contagious, that's an important factor, especially if I think when you talk about collaboration, you have to talk about power, like who's in the room, who's supposed to collaborate. And if there are more powerful people in the room, you have to find ways to kind of neutralize that power if you want people to feel open to expressing their opinion. I mean, and in some cases, you literally have to remove that from the room.
Sure.
Like sometimes if you're doing like user research, I had a friend, we actually talk about this in the prologue to the book. The foreword was written by Yasmin Mustafa, who's a fantastic entrepreneur who does a product that helps women who are being assaulted in the hotel industry. There's a horrifyingly high number of assaults that happen to service workers in the hotel industry. And so she does her research, obviously, with people who work in hotels. And the initial round of that, she was doing research in a room with a bunch of people who work in hotels and a bunch of people who, own hotels and manage hotels, right? And clearly the people, working at the hotels did not feel free to give their honest opinions because someone with very much power over them,
sure,
right, was in the room. So in order to get a more honest feedback and helpful feedback, those people literally needed to not be in the room. So in some cases, to neutralize the power differential in a collaboration, you just simply have to segregate to some extent and then progressively add more information.
Well, I love the idea, though, of the writing something down and all sharing it at the same time. I can see, how helpful that can be. Along with this, I guess we all have responsibilities that we should be aware of how we respond to something and how our answer is going to influence those other folk in the room as well. So it's interesting to think about this and how you would alter your own behavior in a collaboration being aware of it.
Yeah, and I think there's like methods or modes of idea generation that like make that a little bit softer. So in the book, I talk about this method called 8UP. And the idea is that if you have to answer a how might we question, right? You're in the idea generating phase of a design. One helpful approach is to get, say, 8 people in a room, preferably with some degree of diversity in terms of both their job function. Like, let's say you're working with a client or your organization. They have some degree of diversity in terms of their job function and some degree of diversity in terms of their power, right? Like they could be entry level or they could be, the CEO, whatever. But you get 8 people in a room and you basically say, how might we, let's say the problem is, moving people around. It's a transportation issue. How might we do a better job of moving people around? And you say, okay, all 8 of you write down 3 ideas of how we might do that. I'm going to give you 3 minutes, write down 3 ideas on your own, how we might do that, right?
Okay.
3 minutes are up. Great. You've got 8 people who each have 3 ideas. You say, okay, person number 1, show your 3 ideas to your neighbor. Person number 2, show your 3 ideas to your neighbor, to person number 1, and take those 6 ideas and whittle them down to 2, right?
Right.
And so you time box that, and then they go through that, and now you've got a whole bunch of pairs of people who have 2 ideas each, And you say, okay, pair number one, show your 2 ideas to pair number 2. Pair number 2, show your ideas to pair number 1. Take those 4 ideas, whittle them down to 2. And you can see how this kind of keeps whittling down and whittling down until finally you have 8 people all discussing, I think it's like 4 ideas that they then whittle down to 1. And that becomes like the winning idea. And what's nice about this approach is, one, to your point of like how you talk about a thing might influence people in the group, that influence sort of gets lessened until the very end.
Sure.
Right? And if you have like, you know, someone who dominates conversations, I think we all know this person.
I may be that person sometimes.
You may be this person, right? But if there's one voice that tends to be louder, and if it was everyone talking at once, would tend to get their way, well, their influence is diminished until the very end, right? Because in the first round, they have no one to talk to. In the second round, they can only talk to one other person, and so on, right?
Right.
And then the other nice thing about that is, just from an idea generation standpoint, the DNA of every person in that room tends to end up in that final idea, because you're progressively adding their influence rather than just sort of Lord of the Flying it and having everyone sort of, you know, free for all.
With that, there's also an ownership to the idea that everyone gets to feel, which is great.
What's nice about that ownership is that when the going gets tough, as it will, that idea will be harder to abandon. You're almost leveraging a bias around, like, you know, sunk cost fallacy or whatever. But that once you own that idea, it's much harder to abandon it when the going gets tough than if I walk in the room and I like just give you an idea and you're like, oh, that's a great idea. But if the going gets tough, you can say, well, that was Dave's idea, so we can ditch it.
Awesome. Are there any other ones that come to mind?
There are lots, actually. Like what you sort of run into is when you're talking about collaboration biases, right? You're talking about social biases. You're talking about biases that have to do with how we interact with each other. And there's a whole, I think all of season 3 of my podcast was about that. And often these come down to what's called the fundamental attribution error, which is basically a fancy word for how, like, if you're driving, if you're driving and someone runs a red light, like you see someone else run a red light, you're like, oh, that person must be a really bad driver. They're irresponsible, you know, whatever. If you run a red light, oh, I was late, right? Or somebody behind me was honking and I was, you know, getting scared, whatever, right? When someone else does something bad, we attribute that behavior to something about them personally, right? There must be something wrong with them. When we do something bad, oh, we attribute it to the circumstances. There was something driving me to do it. Anyone else would have done the same, right?
Sure.
So it's this very self-serving kind of bias. And so if you think about that in the context of collaboration, it becomes very hard to listen to other people, right? And to take them at their word or have a good faith interaction with someone if anytime they do something you disagree with, you think it's because there's something wrong with them, right? If you're able to step back from that and say, well, no, let me look at the context. Let me try to understand why you hold that opinion or why you want to take that approach. All of a sudden, you're in a better place. And hopefully they're doing the same thing with you, right? You're in a much better place to actually work the problem instead of accuse each other of being bad people.
Sure. Do you think, knowing all of this, that there's value when you're starting a project, maybe with a new team? And whenever I talk to guests, you know, I'm in the classroom doing collaboration with my design students, and I'm also talking to folks in the field. And I think there's value in thinking about both groups. But is there value in talking about cognitive biases when you first kind of come together and having that conversation so that everyone is aware and can keep that in their back of their heads?
I think so. I think it has a limited value because the really nasty thing about biases is even if we know about them, we tend to still commit them, which is why you need to do things like even if you know about bandwagon effect, if you don't have everyone write down their sticky answers, you're still going to have that problem. Like if I know about bandwagon effect, and the highest paid person in the room has a different opinion to me, I'm still probably going to be tempted to agree with them, even though I know about the bias, right? Because
you're worried about your job.
Yeah, exactly. Like the bias kicks in, like by its very definition, bias is something that's happening at a subconscious level. It's not something you can actively, like, unless you're really, really, really focusing, actively like avoid. It's much easier or more effective, at least in the short term, to have some kind of mechanism in effect, like writing down your answers on a sticky. Like that's a workaround. It's a way to kind of counter the bias rather than try to force yourself to not act that way. It's very hard to do that. It's not how we're built.
Right.
So I think, yes, absolutely we should discuss those things. And on that note, I think that it's important to do things. There are things I think that are helpful, again, at that idea generating phase, like at that kickoff phase, that can help in terms of acknowledging bias. There's a thing called an assumption audit,
okay,
which actually didn't make it into the book. I learned about it after.
It's got to be for the second copy, the second
Exactly,
edition. You
yeah.
got to add it in.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for selling my book. But basically, it's sort of adapted from something Project Inkblot did, a design for diversity framework they came up with, which I highly recommend you check out. It's fantastic.
Okay.
It's sort of this idea of getting your biases on the table before you actually begin the work. And so, like, let's say you have your team. Before you begin the work, you get your team in a room and you ask, okay, what identities are represented, on this team? And you're really self-identifying only as you feel comfortable, but you're thinking about things like age or education or income.
Sure.
And then you say, okay, well, how might those identities influence the outcome of this project, right? And then you ask, who isn't in this room right now, right? Anybody here ever been incarcerated, right? Anybody here, ever had their immigration status questioned? Like, are there certain lived experiences that just simply aren't represented here? And then you ask, well, how might that lack of diversity, how might that lack of perspective affect the outcome of this project, right? Mm-hmm. And then finally you ask, okay, well, how might we include, honor, and give power to some of these voices in the design process, right? And that's a way of just sort of saying, acknowledging that, we don't know it all. We probably have holes in our thinking that are going to affect how this project goes. And let's try to find, before we begin the work.
Right.
And then have to retroactively do all of that before we start that work, before we even do the research, right? Because this could impact who you need to talk to. Let's try to figure out where those sort of bias gaps are, as opposed to just thinking functionally about, oh, this is a pharmaceutical product, so we should probably talk to doctors, blah, 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 blah. Like there's that, ground level, right, pre-work you want to do. But this is taking that one step further to say, like, I give you an example. If you were building Uber, from day one, you would obviously want to talk to people who don't own cars. You'd obviously want to talk to people who are in the gig economy because those might be your employees. It might not occur to you to talk to taxi drivers, but taxi drivers are going to be very impacted by your work, right? They're not your customer, they're not your employee, but they live in the ecosystem you're playing in. And so it becomes, like, from an ethical standpoint, a matter of pride to, say, okay, we did actually consider. And there's some really excellent examples of what happens when you do kind of calculate those things. Because what happens when you don't is you end up, like, having to fight the city, right? And fight taxi drivers and, like, all the troubles that Uber has had and all the troubles that Lyft has had. Like, those were going to happen anyway. But what would have happened if they had considered, oh, let's actually include, taxi drivers in that ecosystem and how we design this thing.
Right. And I think even just having those conversations, whether or not, you're able to get all of those voices heard, I think having them and being aware of it probably also, does some good for the project.
Absolutely. There's a bias called the framing effect. And, what it basically boils down to is the way that I frame a conversation or an interaction highly affects it. If I have, like, a photo of a senior citizen behind the wheel of a car and I ask an audience, should this person drive this car, they'll have a big policy discussion on, they'll just debate, back and forth, but they won't actually come to, like, any kind of real solution.
Right.
If I show that same photo and ask how might this person drive this car, they'll come up with a bunch of design solutions, right? And I just changed two words in that whole question, right? But it completely changed how they carried out that conversation. The same thing's true in design. If I start out a design by saying, hey, how can we, design Uber so that it really helps our bottom line? Okay, my frame now is going to be looking to, cut corners ethically, perhaps even, but certainly in terms of the design to say, what's the most efficient way to make this generate money for Uber? If I ask a completely different question and say, oh, I want to figure out how I can design this in a way that accounts for the people I didn't think of when I first came up with the idea. Okay, now I've got a completely different hat on, and my subconscious now is going to be doing the work of, like, looking for those gaps and being like, oh, wait, but if we do that, it's really going to hurt, it's going to really put, like, women at risk, or it's really going to, really hurt the Uber driver or taxi drivers or whatever, right? But if I don't put that frame in place from the start, it's much less likely it'll even occur to me that there are all these risk factors for the society.
Yeah, it's really interesting, just the power of switching just a few words and how that, because I someone had recommended this and I changed in my classroom, instead of at the end of talking about whatever it might be, saying, do you have any questions? Just changing that to what are your questions? It's just the response is so different. And, I think it gives the students the opportunity to know that I anticipate questions and that it's okay to ask a question. And so I always find it so interesting that if we, slow down and think about how we word a problem, a question, how much it could change the outcome.
Yeah, the one of my favorite examples of this comes from Jerry McGovern talked about this in one of his talks, where if you look at 911 calls, I forget if this was here or in Britain, but if you change the wording of when the 911 operator picks up the phone and says either what happened or what has happened, it can actually shave off life-saving seconds from the response time.
Wow.
Because if you ask what happened, the person on the other end of the phone is going to sort of think back throughout the day, right? And be like, well, I woke up, I did this, right? If you ask what has happened, that localizes the information to like literally just now what has happened, which is the information you want, right?
Wow.
But even that little, just tiny bit of framing, right, can literally save lives.
Wow. That's amazing. All right. What about an in-group bias when you're working in a team?
So so in-group bias is basically, again, kind of what it sounds like. You tend to identify with folks who are like you or even who you've been told are like you and immediately separate out people who are not like you. So it is shockingly easy to make this happen. So they've done experiments where they have like a classroom and they just basically randomly assign like group A and group B. And within seconds, people who have never met each other start thinking about, well, people in Group A are a little bit better than people in Group B, right? And people and people who are in Group A are like, well, we should sit at the front of the class, right? Like, and they literally don't know anyone else in the room, but they already now have this common bond around being Group A. So we're kind of hardwired to make these associations and make these groups because at some point it was useful for us to be able to like band together and hunt the mammoth and, take it down before the other tribe did. Like there was some value in like, trash talking the other tribe and, thinking you were awesome.
Yeah. I feel like it's built into us. I mean, go back to like day camp and color war, like from young age, you're placed on a team and that's your group now.
Yeah. And we do it in the corporate world, very easily, right? Like there's IT and there's marketing and there's legal, right? And you have these different job functions, or you have people with literally the same job function, but you're working on project A and this other group is working on project B. And what companies usually do is exacerbate this by how they incentivize. And it's like, well, project team A, you're going to get more budget next year if you bring in your project on time. And if you don't, project B is going to get that budget, right? Like they set up these competitions, even without realizing it sometimes, that create all that siloing that we sort of abhor, like when we work in organizations.
Absolutely.
Like when you see that siloing, odds are the corporate incentive structure is set up to encourage that siloing. So that's part of the problem. I think with all of that, you have to look at, like I said, the incentive structure. If you can change the incentive structure to something more like, hey, if the company as a whole learns more next year, right, and we're smarter at the end of the year, okay, well that will encourage us to work cross-disciplinary because team A might know something that team B doesn't, and if we share information, then everybody wins, right? You have to ask yourself if you're even set up for non-zero-sum game kind of scenarios, like so rather than scarcity, you're kind of building for abundance. So that's one way to combat that. And I think another way is like literally how you design the environment can have a lot to do with how much in-group, out-group bias like is encouraged or not. So an example I love to think about is Taiwan, which was it's a bit of a long story, but if you'll indulge me.
Go for it.
Yeah. So back in the day, Taiwan was about to introduce this new tax law that was going to give China more power over Taiwan, very similar to the what caused all of the protests in Hong Kong over the past couple of years.
Okay.
So you literally had students occupying the Taiwanese parliament, right? And what you would expect is for Taiwan to bring out the tear gas, but instead they said, hey, leader of this movement, why don't you literally join the cabinet? We'll create a position for you that's like cyber czar or something. And let's collaborate on this.
Wow.
And what they ended up, I know it's amazing, right? what they ended up creating is this process that's called Taiwan. And the idea is It's almost like if you took a GitHub, but you applied it to Parliament. But the idea is to create this collaborative platform that encourages more nuanced policy and discourages kind of like polarization and in-group, out-group. And the way they did it was super clever. Let's take the example, again, of Uber, right? So they have the same problems with Uber that every other, and ride sharing that pretty much every other city does, right? And so what they did was they said, okay, we're going to put out a whole bunch of different just statements, right? Statements like, I think that people who do ride sharing should have a license to do so. And they would like text this to a whole bunch of people. Mm-hmm. And then the response, the only possible response was agree, disagree, or pass. There was no reply button. And I cannot tell you how important it was that there was no reply button, because pulling out the reply button meant you couldn't troll the system, right? I couldn't post some horrible incendiary response to that just to get people riled up and then start a flame war. Or if I wanted to post something, because you could post your own statement, right, to the platform.
Okay.
But again, if you do that, the only possible response is agree, disagree, or pass. You can't sort of post something that's meant to offend people just to get a rise out of them because there's no reply button. You can never see the rise, right?
Wow.
So you've added all of this friction to trolling, but you've incentivized, right, understanding at a very general, anonymized level, how do people feel? And that's where the second beautiful design choice comes in. Instead of being like, okay, Bob thought this and Jane thought that, the way it was arranged is you could see what different groups of people agreed or disagreed with, right? Like there's a visual that kind of showed you how that mapped out. And the groups of people might start out as Uber drivers, taxi drivers, Uber passengers, taxi passengers, right?
Right.
And the way the platform worked, it showed you when Uber drivers and taxi drivers both agreed with a statement, right? It would highlight that. Or when Uber drivers and Uber passengers agreed with a statement. And this incentivized more nuanced statements, because when you say something really polarizing and really incendiary and outrageous, really only one group is going to agree with that. If you can find statements that 2 or even 3 groups agree with, they're likely to be much more nuanced and understanding and based on a common ground. So what ends up happening is, over time, those 4 groups form into maybe 2 groups, like pro-Uber, anti-Uber. And then eventually start finding statements that even pro and anti-Uber groups agree with. And one of those statements was something like, I think that taxis should have the same 5-star rating system as Uber because we think that's what makes Uber a good service. Everybody agreed with it. Pro and anti-Uber agreed with that. And they eventually could take statements that everybody agreed with and then give them over to the Taiwanese parliament to actually create policy around. And in that story, what they ended up doing was taking the technology from Uber and putting it in taxis, which is this very kind of subtle but very powerful policy choice that I don't think if you just put a bill in Congress or had people fight about it on Twitter, right? I don't think you'd get to that nuanced of a solution. But because you made these design choices along the way that encouraged collaboration and discouraged in-group, out-group bias, right, you were able to get there.
Wow.
So I know it's a really long-winded explanation, but it needs to be, because we're not used to thinking about using design to discourage in-group and out-group. Usually we use design to make it clear who's on what side, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, you know, where my brain goes is, okay, so now how do we apply this to what we're living through right now? But we don't have a whole season to talk about it.
Yeah.
So.
But yeah, you can see there's obvious implications for how we do policy in the States, right? Like this is not,
sure.
They used out-of-the-box software called Polis to do this. Like they didn't have to even build any new technology. They just used existing technology. So we could literally hack this together in a weekend if we wanted to. Yeah, I think at this point it's more of a political will issue than a design issue. But I think the good news is if we wanted to do this, the tools are there.
Absolutely. Let's do it. Let's go for it. I've been racking my brain on what the heck I'm going to do. So shifting gears a little bit, and this impacts us for many different things. But what about the planning fallacy?
Oh my God.
Groups.
Yeah, I don't even necessarily think of this as just a collaboration, bias as much as it is just a project. Yeah, life and project. You'll find most of these biases affect life as well. But no, so this planning fallacy is basically this idea that however long you think something is going to take, it's always going to take longer. And we always assume things are going to be easier than they actually are, and that they're going to go faster than they actually are. Again, it just comes back to like our minds tend to simplify things and we tend to overestimate. Like we tend to be, as a rule, humans are terrible at predicting the future. whether it's the future from a logistical standpoint, how long something is going to take, whether it's the future in terms of how am I going to feel about something, even a few days from now.
Sure.
Like we are terrible at predicting that. And the reason we're terrible at predicting that is because we always make predictions based on our current state. Like, how do I feel right now? Like, I feel right now like it should only take 6 weeks to build this website, regardless of the fact that every time I've tried to build a website in the past, it's taken 6 months. But for some reason, right now, it feels like, well, I know it should only take 6 weeks, right? So, and that's why we've built all these, like, that's why Agile builds estimating into, like, part of the reason, for all the knocks against Agile is really good at countering some of these biases, like when it's done right, because it's actually meant to dissuade you of the notion that how you feel about something right now is an accurate, predictor of the future. It's meant to be a self-learning system where it's like, whoa, before you estimate that, how long did it take last time, right? So I think that approach, again, it comes down to creating processes that say, I know how you feel right now, but let's actually look at the facts in a time-worn process that brings other perspectives to the table before we definitively say or promise to the client or promise to our boss it's going to take this long.
Yeah, I feel like I've worked so hard to counter that now I'm like, I get to be surprised. I'm like, oh, it didn't take as long as I actually, because I just go by the triple whatever you initially think.
Triple is a very good estimate. And honestly, in the days of COVID, it's like shruggy emoji. Yeah. Like every estimation session just be a big shruggy. I don't know.
I know. Try our best. Yeah, I mean for me, that also is coming with experience,
Yeah.
Now being in the industry for 20 years, I can always say, like, you just, whatever you think, just always triple. And I know that's the history of how things work. And I feel like every year that goes by, I give myself even more time because I keep adding to it.
Well, and I have a question for you, right? Like without telling tales out of school, how much of that extra time is around human factors, right? Understanding that, yes, I know literally it only takes this long to build, this database or migrate this content, but I have to deal with human beings, and human beings will stall. Yep. Human beings will resist. Human beings will go through 7 rounds of decision making, right? Like how much have you learned? Basically, how much?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the biggest one is, there's always the client who's like, I need this yesterday. Mm-hmm. And I always say, this is the timeline. And, I'm just letting you know that typically delays happen on the client side. Yeah. And in the approval, and they're like, no, we need this. And then, the project sits for 2 months. Yeah. So after going through that plenty of times, so there's plenty of people, and there's the thinking. I feel like everyone underestimates the time you have to take to process and to that not sitting right in front of your computer time. It's all part of a project. Yeah. And you forget you need that time to have those conversations, to just kind of think through something when you're not expecting to be working on it.
There's a high degree of invisible labor. I think there's absolutely the thinking, because like when you work in a factory, it's kind of easy for a boss to look out on the factory floor and see people doing stuff and feel like, yep, they're earning their money. Right. When you're in sort of knowledge work and you sort of look at someone and they're like just sitting there, you're like, well, you're clearly not doing anything. When in fact, they could be doing a lot. Right. I think there's that invisible labor, which is hard to communicate the value of. And I think there's a lot of emotional labor that is also extremely time consuming, where it's like, I could, if you'd let me, just write this email or create this deck. But I know from the politics of your organization that you're going to see it first, tell me to tweak this word and that word, because, your boss is going to react badly to this or that particular way of phrasing things. And now I have to put all this extra labor into making it just right, not because of the information I'm communicating, but because of the politics that you are playing, which are just as much of an input into whether or not the project happens.
I love you to talk about the emotional part too, because along with that is the stepping away for a minute to be like, I can't believe I have to do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's time. I mean, it takes you away, and then you have to get back into things. So all of that you have to know that might happen.
Yeah, and I feel like, that's sort of my own little pet intellectual project is like finding a way to scope emotional labor and scope thinking. I am, firm in my belief that that should be paid for as well. So, but figuring out, and it's very hard to pay for things you can't count. So it's like, I'm trying to figure out ways to create like the countability of emotional labor. And this is something people are actually working on. It's kind of neat.
That's interesting.
But
what do you know anything about what they're working on? I'd love to.
So the most basic form of it, right? If you don't mind me, speaking a little out of turn, is what some freelancers call the asshole tax, which is basically like, I know this client is going to be difficult, so I'm going to charge them a multiplier for the work, just because I know if this were a more reasonable client, this would all go much more smoothly, and I could just write the email. I wouldn't have to, whereas I know you're going to be a jerk about this, so, and I know I'm not going to enjoy that.
Yep.
And I should be paid more for the difficulty, and literally it's going to take longer. So I'm going to do like a 1.5 charge on what would usually be like 1x. So that's their one version of it, just to represent that.
Which could easily be like a calculator, put in the different. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can see that working great.
Yeah. I'm thinking a lot about a concept, not to get too heady here, but called X-formation, which it comes from the worlds of information technology, or information science, but it's basically this idea of X-formation is all the information you have to remove from a statement to give it meaning. So an example might be, there's this famous story of when Victor Hugo wrote Les Mis. He was in France, and his editor was in England, in London. And he sent I think it was a telegram, wanting to know how the book was doing. And the telegram was simply one symbol. It was just a question mark. And then the editor sends back one symbol, an exclamation point, right? And if you think about it, like for those two individuals, that had all the meaning in the world. They totally got what the editor got what Victor was asking, and the response, Victor totally understood it, right? But to get down to just that one little character, they had to remove so much information, right, to get down to that. So a huge amount of X-formation is represented in that communication. I think about that a lot when I think about like one of the most tangible, right, forms of emotional labor might be how you have to phrase an email to a client if you know that client is, not to put too fine a point on it, but very touchy, right? Or very like easy for them to just go off on something that isn't important. And so where I could just write ba 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 and send it, I have to be like, okay, let me scan every single one of these words to make sure that I'm not hitting like this one word that I know is going to be like, well, wait, you said this. And it's like, no, it's just the same thing. You know what I mean? So that there's a lot of information I have to pull out of that email to get it just right for the client. So I basically, long story short, I'm thinking there's a way to use X-formation as a way to quantify emotional labor. That's my pet theory. But I think it's a worthy endeavor because honestly, I would say the bulk of labor in consultant work, right, and building, just design, is emotional labor. I would not be surprised if we found some way to measure it. We would find like a 10-to-1 ratio of actual design work versus the sort of like heavy lifting of human relationships.
Sure. Oh, I need that for sure for some clients. Any other ones that come to mind? I went through some that I was thinking about.
I mean, I think that you can't underestimate. I'll point you to the book, but I think if you look at, I think it's chapter 3 of my book, I really talk about stakeholder biases, and that's where a lot of the kind of collaboration biases come in. But I end that chapter with a case study that really shows you the impact of design on collaboration, both from a physical standpoint. So in the future, when we are physically present with each other again.
One day we will be, right?
Yeah, let's hold out hope. I sent in to have my passport renewed the other day. It's like the most hopeful thing I've done in ages.
I've been thinking about doing it too, but I'm like, I can't like get myself too excited yet.
It's like, it's going to take 3 months. I'm like, take your time. But when you are physically present, the items in the room, the way the room is arranged, will all impact, like even something as simple as, is there a briefcase present in the room? If there's a briefcase that everyone can see in the room, people will act more competitively. It's ridiculous, but it's true.
Wow.
Right? So things like that can affect collaboration, but even the agenda, right? So in this case study, I talk about how they changed the agenda of this one important budget meeting. And one of the key decisions they made was to save the actual talk of the budget to the end, because when you bring up money, either as a symbol, like literally seeing a dollar sign, or just, talking about it in the agenda, it's like, let's look at the budget. When you talk about money, people become less social, right? They become much more selfish, much more competitive, much less empathetic. It's just, how we've been primed to think about money. And so, and this particular budget decision was around like vulnerable populations. So you wanted people to be empathetic while they had this discussion, right?
Right.
So what they did was they said, well, we're going to have the first part of the meeting be about talking about needs, right? What do these people need, right? Before we even talk about money. And then at the very last possible moment, we've kind of like bucketed and prioritized these needs and figured out which ones have to do with money and which ones don't. Then at the very end, we'll talk about money, because that's when your greed is going to kick in, right? And you're going to be less pros. So let's make sure that we've prioritized all of that before we introduced this content element to the agenda that we know is that you have a bias that's gonna, trigger you to act less socially. So even the order in which you talk about things, right, can influence how good you're going to be at collaborating. So that case study is a really good example of how I think what we underestimate is the role that external factors play in collaboration.
Okay.
We usually think about it in terms of like what intent is everyone bringing to the meeting, which is important, but we underestimate how powerful the design of that collaboration can be on the results, regardless of the intent of the people involved.
Right. And that's, a concrete way someone, if you're in a, collaboration, is to kind of take control of that agenda and think about how the meeting is ran and how you can set it up for success and to try to combat some of it. I think that's great. Well, thank you so much, David, for being here today. This was a really great talk. For everyone listening, if you haven't read David's book, Design for Cognitive Bias, I can't recommend it enough. It really is truly amazing. And thank you so much for writing it for all of us. I think it's needed now more than ever. So it's a great book to have.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. If anyone wants to, get the book or, book me for a talk or any of those good things, or just say hi, I'm at daviddylan-thomas.com, and you can find all that stuff there.
Great. Thanks, David. Thank you all so much for listening. If you are enjoying our show, please post us a review on whatever podcast streaming platform you use. To learn more about us, check out our website at designtogetherpod.com.